a fighter jet spins out of control, its engine screaming as it plummets toward a crowd of thousands. In seconds, a celebration turns into chaos. Flaming debris tears through families, and the airfield becomes a scene of unimaginable horror. 77 people dead and hundreds injured. But was it really just a tragic accident, or something far more preventable? This is the Sknyliv airshow disaster. It was supposed to be a day of celebration. Families, children, and military enthusiasts gathered at the Sknyliv airfield near Lviv, Ukraine, on July 27, 2002. More than 10,000 people filled the grounds, excited to see the Ukrainian Air Force showcase its strength and skill. People wandered between parked planes, snapping photos with their children, buying snacks from vendors, and waiting for the highlight of the day, the aerobatic performance by one of the most powerful fighter jets in the world, the Sukhoi Su-27UB. The event marked the 60th anniversary of the Ukrainian Air Force's 14th Air Corps, and it promised an unforgettable show. What no one knew was how true that promise would become, but for all the wrong reasons. At 12:52 p.m., the deep roar of the jet engines echoed across the field. The crowd turned their eyes skyward, some shielding their faces from the sun, others raising cameras to capture the sleek silhouette of the Su-27 as it soared into the air. The aircraft was piloted by Volodymyr Toponar, a highly experienced officer from the elite Ukrainian Falcons, with his co-pilot Yuri Yegorov seated beside him. Both were seasoned, trusted men with years of flight time behind them. The jet gleamed in the sunlight, cutting through the air effortlessly. The audience was mesmerized as the aircraft performed loops and barrel rolls. But as the jet pulled into a rolling maneuver, something wasn't right. You could feel it in the air, a subtle shift. The jet was descending, faster than it should have been. It rolled upright, but it didn't stabilize. Instead of leveling out, the aircraft continued its downward path, its nose dipping dangerously low. At that moment, the left wing began to drop. The pilots, realizing something was wrong, pulled the ejection handles. Two small figures shot into the sky as their seats rocketed out of the doomed jet. Their parachutes opened, fluttering like ghostly warnings above the field. But down below, there was no time to react. The Su-27 slammed into the ground with a deafening roar, its heavy frame skidding across the tarmac. It scraped against the nose of a massive transport plane parked nearby. But it didn't stop. The impact only fueled its momentum. The aircraft, now a deadly missile, cartwheeled forward, tearing into the crowd. There was no time to scream, no time to run. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. The jet disintegrated, sending flaming debris and shrapnel flying in every direction. The force of the blast ripped through the air, a violent wave that threw people off their feet. The fireball consumed everything in its path. Scorching jet fuel sprayed across the tarmac, igniting anything it touched. Families who had been laughing moments before were now engulfed in chaos and horror. The screams were everywhere, of pain, fear, and disbelief. Within minutes, the grassy field had turned into a scene of unspeakable horror. Bodies lay scattered, some lifeless, others barely clinging on. The pilots landed safely under their parachutes, but the sight that met them on the ground was something no training could prepare them for. 77 people were dead, including 28 children. Over 500 more were injured, many with burns, broken bones, and deep psychological scars that would never heal. Some witnesses described the runway as being littered with body parts, the smell of burning flesh mixing with jet fuel in the suffocating summer heat. Rescue workers rushed to the scene, but what could they do in the face of such devastation? They moved quickly, pulling survivors from the wreckage, tending to the injured, and trying to make sense of the carnage. But there were too many. The sheer scale of the disaster overwhelmed everyone. After the smoke cleared and the fires were put out, the horror at Sknyliv airfield left a country in shock. Families were torn apart, and people across Ukraine were asking the same question. How could this happen? The pilots had survived, but the real story was just beginning. The investigation started immediately. The Ukrainian government wanted answers, fast. After all, This wasn't some small accident. This was the deadliest airshow disaster in history. 77 people dead, over 500 injured, and the whole world was watching. At first glance, it didn't make sense. Both pilots were highly experienced. Volodymyr Toponar, the pilot, had 27 years of flying under his belt. He was part of the Ukrainian Falcons, the Air Force's elite aerobatic team. His co-pilot, Yuri Yegorov, was no rookie either. And the plane itself, the Sukhoi Su-27UB, was known for being reliable. So what went wrong? As investigators dug deeper, cracks started to show. First, there was the issue of preparation. Before the show, Toponar had asked for something simple, a practice flight at Sknyliv airfield. He wanted to get a feel for the space, check out the layout, and make sure everything was in order for the complex maneuvers they had planned. But the Air Force denied his request. Why? Money. They didn't want to cover the costs of extra flights. Instead, they handed him a flight map and expected his years of experience to fill in the gaps. But there was a big problem with that map. It didn't match the real layout of the airfield. On the day of the show, the organizers made a last-minute decision to switch the performance area to the opposite side of the field. They also moved the spectator zones, but no one told the pilots. They were flying blind, relying on incorrect information. As they took off, Toponar and Yegorov expected the crowd to be in one place, but in reality, they were flying directly toward them. During the flight, cockpit recordings captured a chilling moment. One of the pilots asked, You could hear the confusion in his voice. They couldn't spot the crowd where they expected them to be, but the show had already started, and they were under orders to proceed with their routine. Here's where things took a darker turn. Military pilots are trained to follow orders. Even when something feels wrong, they stick to the plan. That's what they did. They moved into their final maneuver, a rolling loop at low altitude. But with the wrong layout in mind, they miscalculated. Then came the technical failure. As they attempted the maneuver, both engines lost thrust. The jet started to slow down, dropping in altitude faster than it should have. Toponar fought to regain control, but it was too late. The plane was descending too quickly, and when they realized they were heading straight for the crowd, there was nothing they could do. Yegorov pulled the ejection handle just seconds before the jet slammed into the ground. The investigation should have ended there, pointing to a mix of poor planning, miscommunication, and mechanical failure. But that's not what happened. On August 7th, less than 2 weeks after the crash, the investigation, led by National Security and Defense Secretary Yevhen Marchuk, announced its findings. The blame was placed squarely on the pilots. Marchuk claimed Toponar and Yegorov had failed to follow the flight plan and performed dangerous maneuvers too close to the crowd. Event organizers were criticized, but the focus was on the pilots. Toponar wasn't having it. He rejected the findings, insisting that the faulty flight map, denied practice flights, and technical problems caused the crash. He pointed out that during the final maneuver, both engines lost power and the airspeed dropped unexpectedly. But his protests fell on deaf ears. The government wasn't just looking for answers, they were looking for someone to punish. President Leonid Kuchma fired the head of the Ukrainian Air Force, General Viktor Strelnikov. The Minister of Defense even offered to resign, but Kuchma refused. The public wanted justice, and for the government, that meant holding the pilots responsible. In 2005, 3 years after the crash, the verdict came down. A military court sentenced Volodymyr Toponar to 14 years in prison. Yuri Yegorov got 8 years. But it didn't stop there. 3 other military officials were also found guilty. 2 were sentenced to up to 6 years, and 1 received 4. Toponar was ordered to pay over $1.4 million in compensation to the victims' families, while Yegorov had to pay about $500,000. Toponar vowed to appeal. He never stopped insisting the crash wasn't his fault. He argued that the flight parameters they were given were wrong and that no pilot could have safely performed under those conditions. He pointed to the fact that planes should never fly over spectators, a basic rule that was ignored at this event. He even highlighted how ground control ordered them to continue the routine, even as things were clearly going wrong. But none of that changed the outcome. In 2008, Yegorov was released early after his sentence was reduced, but Toponar served almost his full term. When he was finally freed, his life was nothing like it used to be. He was banned from driving any vehicle, including bicycles. Meanwhile, the victims' families struggled to find closure. The government allocated some money, about $200,000 total, but it wasn't enough. Some families received as little as $7,000, while others got $40,000. And the biggest question remained unanswered. Was true justice ever served? The full details of what led to the disaster were never made public. The final investigation report wasn't released, and no one fully explained why the flight map was wrong or why the safety guidelines were ignored. Even today, people wonder if the pilots were scapegoats for a much larger failure.